Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, Migrating Your Data to AWS. My name is Chris Rogers. I'm a Global BD on the storage team, and I'm joined today by Brian Berezovin. Brian's also on the Storage BD team, and Paul Reed, who is a Principal Product Manager for Storage Gateway. We're going to be talking to you today about data migration with AWS. And wanted to first say, before we go too far into this, that you do have live experts standing by to take your questions. So we want you to be able to ask questions. We're going to ask a lot of rhetorical questions, talk about some use cases, go through some of the services. Some of the questions we might not have full and complete answers to, but if you have questions about your use cases and things that are specific to your migration, please, that's what we want to talk about today. So thanks again for joining and taking the time to listen. And so now as we jump in, guys, I wanted to start by thinking about some key questions that customers might think about migrations. And it really kind of starts with the who's, what's, and whys, right? And there's lots of different options when you think about a migration for customers out there that are listening to this. I think the first question is, why are they going to move data to AWS? Why do they want to move to the cloud? And then there's some follow-ons there. So Paul, I'll start with you. As you're talking to customers, day in and day out, what are some of the reasons that customers tell you that they want to move to AWS?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So we hear lots of customers who want to just migrate to AWS. They're an all-in customer. They have existing on-premises storage. In many cases, they want to help moving that storage from where it exists today in your data centers into AWS and into one of our native storage services. So migration and all-in migration is certainly a big part of the discussions we have with a number of customers.
Sure.
Another use case that I hear a lot are customers who have workloads. So we think of this sort of hybrid world where I have a workload that maybe runs on premises and I want to do some processing in cloud as well. So you can think of things like manufacturing and production facilities where I'm generating data on premises, maybe on a manufacturing line, and I want to analyze that data in the cloud.
Right.
So I need to be able to move that data into the cloud for analysis, maybe even bring the results back on premises to tune my production facility to get better yield out of it.
Sure.
So again, this idea of sort of active data movement between on-premises and the cloud, basically shipping data to where you want to process it.
Right. And that's great. Thanks, Paul. And, there's a lot of reasons why people want to move to the cloud. The other question that people face, Brian, I'll go to you for this one, is what is the data that you're moving? And that sounds like it might be an obvious question, but we find that customers have challenges just identifying which data to move, whether they need to prioritize the data or they just maybe don't know where the data is. Maybe you can chat about that a bit.
Yeah, certainly. So a lot of our customers run into situations where the data itself is collected in distributed sites. We find that a lot. Certainly, Paul touched on that with our industrial use cases and the customers in those segments. And then run into a lot of scenarios where the data is active versus not active, aka archived. And that's a common use case as well, where the more active data may need to be moved in one way and the less active data moved in another way. So those are kind of common themes we see.
Sure. Great. Thanks, Brian. And then the next question that kind of logically follows this is, where's the data going to go? And that's kind of where AWS comes in. And we're going to talk about some AWS services today that give customers options to put that data. Certainly, I think probably a very well-known storage option with AWS is our simple storage service, S3, which tends to be a source or a destination for many people's data. But there's other options like Amazon S3 Glacier and Glacier Deep Archive, which are for some cold storage options. And I think we'll talk about that. And specifically, these guys are here. They think about migrations and the movement of the data. Brian, you work a lot with Snowball, and Paul, you work with AWS DataSync, which is Snowball is an offline method for moving data to the cloud, and DataSync is an online method for moving to the cloud. And we have some use cases that we'll talk about that actually where those two services can complement each other. Another question that comes up is, when do you need the data? Brian, I was hoping that maybe you could talk, because I know you talk about this with a lot when you're talking about Snowball, is, what's your time frame for moving the data? Do you need it next week or next month or next year? Maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, and I think a common theme with our customer sets is associated with time to value, right? Like, when do I need the data is associated with what I need to do with that data and what value I need to derive from it. So, I talked earlier for a quick moment around the less active data. Certainly, there is less need for moving that data quickly unless there's a data center closure or an end of life or some kind of impetus associated with trying to move that data off, that is currently on premises into the cloud, whether that destination be, Amazon S3 or whether that be Elastic File System. And I think those questions come up a lot. And when I look at, the customer conversations we've had, I find that it varies dramatically, right? Whether it's a corporate need to be able to move this data, right? Or whether there's actually a physical reason, meaning, there is actually a disaster of some sort. Mm-hmm. Those kind of scenarios come up a lot. We have to move that data very fast. And that'll help, I think, delineate what type of migration mechanism you use from AWS and or our Amazon Partner Network solutions. So I
think that makes a lot of sense, right? And I think the other aspect of that, right, the time certainly drives the migration strategy. The other aspect is how much available capacity do you have, right, over the network? Is that could drive not only Snowball, but certainly DataSync, which is an online migration tool. So, Paul, maybe you can talk about, how much does that factor in whether the customer has usable network capacity and how much do they need?
Yeah, and this is a really important consideration for moving any data is basically resource usage. So how much bandwidth do you have from your site to AWS or out to the internet? How much bandwidth do you have on your source storage system, right? At the end of the day, the data lives on that. You have to get it off there, whether you're putting it onto a Snowball to ship it to a physical device or whether you're putting it over your network. And so understanding those constraints that you have within the underlying infrastructure on which you're going to move the data and sort of adding that into the time frame and some of these other criteria is super important to get up front to set your own expectations as to how quickly this could happen.
Right, exactly. Well said. I think just to kind of recap on this discussion, because it kind of frames the rest of this, the topics that we want to dive into with these use cases, right? It's understand why you're moving the data, understand what you're moving. We're going to give you some options for where you move it, and then the when and how much data and how much capacity, network capacity do you have. That really all defines the success or hopefully not the failure, but hopefully defines the efficiency of your migration, right? So I want to talk for a few moments about the AWS portfolio. We have a series of methods, services and products that we can provide our customers to help them get their data into the cloud. And we break it into three categories. We talked about online, like DataSync, and offline, like Snowball. We also have, as far as online data transfer, we have a couple other services. One is CloudEndure, which gives you, we'll talk about that in a few moments. It gives you the ability to do a live migration of virtual machines. You can do, thousands, hundreds of thousands of virtual machines can be migrated or backed up to AWS. And CloudEndure is an acquisition that AWS made earlier this year, and that's now in the AWS family of products. There's also AWS Transfer for SFTP, which is a kind of a niche play in that it's just for SFTP workloads, but it gives you a way to put SFTP data, which is oftentimes financial data or very transactional data, but put that data and move it securely into an S3 bucket. And then finally, on Brian's side of the house, the offline data transfer side, we have Snowball, and we also have Snowball Edge, which is a fairly new release that gives you the ability to do compute at the edge. So not only is that Snowball just a pile of disks that give you storage, but it gives you intelligence, gives you some compute to be able to run maybe Lambda scripts or be able to do some pre-processing of data, things like that. And then we have kind of the associated category with this is we refer to hybrid cloud storage. We have services like Storage Gateway, which gives you the ability, now that the data is in the cloud, to be able to go and access and work with that data. And Paul, you work a lot with Storage Gateway, and we can talk about that. And so moving ahead, let's get into some of these use cases. We wanted to take this as a conversation, which is why we're doing this format for the webinar. And so we brought in the experts to have this conversation. So our first use case, and Brian, I'm going to kind of prep you here,
sure.
But is the use case from an actual customer where they had the need to retire a remote site. I think it was up in Alaska. They had 75 terabytes of machine data, logs, files that they need to archive. They knew that they wanted to get it to a combination of S3 and also maybe Glacier Deep Archive. Some of it was cold storage. And so, Brian, maybe you can take it from there. I don't want to kind of give away the punchline here, but maybe you can take it from there. And
No,
talk
thanks,
about
Chris. We see this certainly a lot, especially with regards to the industrial sector, even the defense sector, and even to a certain degree, within software and internet companies. And we have a service, we talked about Snowball, the Snow family of services that we have, and they really were built to solve this problem.
Right.
And that the problem is a very limited network length, right? A fairly large amount of storage that would take a large amount of time to move off that remote site into AWS. In this case, 75 terabytes, quite a bit. Satellite link at that remote site is limited, so it's kind of a good fit for the Snow family of services. And when we built the Snow family of services, really had a couple different tenets. The first was solving this problem, right? Moving large amounts of data over limited network links or non-existent network links, which does, obviously occasionally happen. And that was really the first tenet. And so we built a device, and I'll kind of go through the different variants of what Snowball, the Snow family services provide you. But we built it really to be a ruggedized device with, as Chris had mentioned, compute and storage, as well as the native AWS services to allow our customers to use their AWS tooling very easily with their on-premises requirements. Starting with Snowball. Snowball, we have two variants, a 50 terabyte and an 80 terabyte, aimed primarily at just data transfer. We also have a Snowball Edge, and that comes in multiple variants. One called Storage Optimized, which is 100 terabytes, and with some compute, limited compute. And we have a Compute Optimized, which comes with obviously more compute, double the amount of computation and memory, as well as 42 terabytes. And we also have a second variant of the Compute Optimized with GPU. Again, I've already stated this, but Snowball Edge really can handle both the data transfer as well as the edge compute. We have a third part of the portfolio called Snowmobile, and that's really aimed at handling up to 100 petabytes on the truck to be able to offload that out of your data center and bring it into AWS. And so that's really kind of the three primary variants. With that, I'd like to just comment on all of the variants, particularly the Snowball, Snowball Edge, and Snowmobile, right? All of them were built with security as a primary tenet. With Snowball and Snowball Edge, not only do we have data protection with multiple layers of encryption using our AWS key management service, but we also have, with the Snowball Edge and Snowball, tamper detection mechanisms built in, whether it's tamper-evident labels to chain of custody tracking, as well as embedded inside the device in what's called the Trusted Platform Module, TPM, of the chipset itself to be able to track any kind of tampering. So that's key. And then in addition, we built the device to be simple to use for you as a customer, right? And that's the way that manifests is we have on it an e-ink label display so that you don't have to worry about having to call FedEx, UPS, whatever, USPS to actually pick up the device and ship it back and worry about all that. That's all done from the minute you put your order in with the device. It shows up on site, right? You use it, whether you use it for edge compute, for pre-processing, you want to use your AWS native services such as Lambda, such as Greengrass, such as EC2, S3, and block volumes, all that's there. Once you're done, turn it off, e-ink label display updates, then you can go ahead and ship it right back. We take care of everything else. And so that's key to we're trying to really make it so that the undifferentiated heavy lifting is really taken off the customer's plate. And I'll bring up one last comment here that is built to be highly ruggedized, right? From being able to handle scenarios like in the remote site that you brought up, right, where it has to be able to handle dust potentially, right, for certain environments, whether that be in the desert, whether that be elsewhere, temperature from a heat and cold perspective, water, so we can handle it's water resistant as well. and vibration. And to that degree, we've also been able to do a DoD barge test on the device and be able to operate it. So I think these are kind of key offline migration and edge compute capabilities in disconnected scenarios.
I don't want to steal any of the thunder. Thanks, Brian, for that. But a couple of the coolest demos I've ever seen at AWS involved a snowball. Number one, we had an SA that did a demo that I think he kicked the snowball off the stage, and then I think it was as part of the DoD testing where we actually had to show that the snowball could survive an explosion, right? So
That's right.
they put it. That's the barge test that you referred to. They actually blow it up, right? And there's video out there, so YouTube fans, you can go check that out. But thanks, Brian. Appreciate the walkthrough for snowball. So let's go into another use case now. And Paul, I'm going to kind of shift my shoulders here to look at you. But this is one where we have it's a NAS migration. And the scenario, and this is derived from actual customers again, it's a migration of an analytics application that needed to be moved along with its data, and they needed to move it into Amazon EFS. And so EFS, Elastic File System, they basically needed to run this application in the cloud. And it's about a petabyte of files. Mm-hmm. So maybe you can talk about what the solution would be there. And people know I'm looking at you, so AWS DataSync is probably going to come into play here.
Yeah, we see a lot of customers trying to do this with DataSync where they have an application that's running, the data set is active, it's being modified, they maybe don't have a good handle on how the application is even modifying that data set. It's sat on a filer, maybe it's been on that filer for a while, and they're super nervous to move it, but they know they want to move the data to AWS, move the application to AWS. So the first step there is to seed the data into the cloud. So let's move the data, and then we can follow up when moving the application. And so with DataSync, what you can do is you can move the initial data set while the application is continuing to work on the primary NAS on premises. DataSync does an incremental forever model. So he'll sync the data over, and then he'll keep syncing changes over from the on-prem source filer into AWS. Then at some point, you can stand up an application in the cloud, an instance of your application. You can point it to that same data set, maybe do some migration testing. And then at the point of cutover, what our customers will often do is they'll quiesce the application on premises. They'll do one final sync, at which point DataSync will transfer over just the changes. And then they'll stand up the application in cloud and point it at the data set. And at that point, the application effectively is moved, data moved ahead of it, and the application's moved. Now, because you're talking about a petabyte of data, obviously, it's going to take a while to move that data. DataSync will move data up to line speed, up to 10 gigabits a second, if you have, say, a 10 gigabit connection, which is about 100 terabytes a day.
Right.
So if you've got a lot of network, then we could potentially move that petabyte in about 10 days.
Yep.
Obviously, if you have lesser network, we'll move data slower than that. Or if you're sharing your network, we allow you to throttle DataSync back so it'll play nice with other applications on your network. So a lot of options there for how to use that scarce resource to get the data into the cloud.
I think that, just to interject a second, I think that's something that's really important for customers, right? Because a lot of times the answer to the question, how much bandwidth do you have? Well, we have a 10 gig link, right? Or we have a 1 gig link. Maybe not everyone has 10. Yeah. But the real question is how much is available? Because certainly on those 10 gig links, customers put other services, other applications. It's really about understanding it, right? And so, if we said maybe realistically there's 5 gigs available, right? Instead of taking 10 days, it takes 20 days to move that petabyte. So.
And again, we see customers in all stages. We see customers that take multiple 10 gig links, bond them together, and want us to just blast the data.
That's right.
Fast as possible, and DataSync will do that too.
That's right.
Again, it's really down to back sort of one of those early questions that we asked is, how much infrastructure do you have? How much infrastructure do you want to use for this data movement?
Yep.
And if it's zero, because it's off, or we're back in the snowball route, if you have some network and you want to trickle that data over in this incremental model using DataSync, then we can again work with that.
Right, and the point is, and you guys are sitting across the table, so it's not like you're competing with each other. The point is that they're complementary, right? And we're actually going to talk about a use case in a few minutes where you could actually use Snowball for some of the data and DataSync for some of the other data.
We see a lot of customers.
You see that quite a bit. So I want to move to talking about DataSync. So Paul, if you want to kind of walk through what DataSync is for people that may not know, maybe not be familiar.
Yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to the core use case of just moving data, and a lot of customers look at this problem of moving data, and either they look at the problem and say, this is untractable, and it effectively roadblocks their migration to the cloud, or they look at this problem and say, this is a really easy problem, and so they think, oh, I'll just script something up and throw something together and that'll move my data. And what it turns out is that for many customers, both those where they view the problem as intractable or those that think it's an easy problem to solve, they quickly realize that actually it's a pretty hard problem to solve. To fill a network pipe, efficiently move data, track those changes, ensure your data moves securely, is integral, so it's validated, and the data's, there's no bit flips, there's nothing modified, and to ensure that it lands in the cloud in a cloud-native way, right? It works with all of the cloud services that you want to be able to use both from a storage standpoint, so S3, EFS, for example, and works with some of the other models, things like IAM, VPCs, some of those other security models, CloudTrail logging to know that you know who's accessing the data, CloudWatch monitoring to make sure you can watch the end-to-end process. And so we built DataSync as a sort of a cloud-first, cloud-integrated solution to help customers move their data from wherever it resides today to wherever you want it. And so at launch, we support NFS sources or NFS destinations, S3 buckets as a source or a destination, and EFS file systems as a source or destination, and any pairing of those. So you can shuttle data both into the cloud or out of the cloud, from on-prem to AWS. Again, we sort of took a lot of the complexity, Brian talked about undifferentiated heavy lift, of moving data and encapsulate that within the service. So things like security come for default. We secure data on the wire. We never store data in our service. It's either in your source or your destination. We take data integrity as sort of job number 2 behind security. We do multiple levels of data validation as it moves around through the service, both at rest on either end, in flight, and as we're writing data. But again, that just all comes as sort of part of the service. We understand how to map files to objects, objects to files. Again, a lot of customers are using both object and file, so we managed to maintain metadata across that transition. And we built it to move data quick. Again, this problem of moving data over a network, often these protocols that we access data with, whether it's the S3 API or NFS, are pretty efficient on the local area networks, but pretty inefficient over a wide area network. And so we built our own protocol to move data at network speeds and maintain all this validation and security along the way.
Yep.
All of the in-cloud infrastructure needed to receive this data and manage it efficiently into or out of the cloud services is taken care of. That's part of the service, so you don't have any in-cloud infrastructure to run. The services run through the AWS console or through the CLI. So again, from an ease of use standpoint, you basically interact with a service. It's data transfer as a service. It's
right.
Kind of the bumper sticker, I guess.
Right.
Where I'm going with all this.
And I think that's really important, right? Because we probably have people that are watching this that use the console, want to know how to get started. They could go out today and they could, go out and fire up a DataSync and start playing with it and start looking at moving their own workloads. And likewise, Snowball, you can go out and Snowball is ordered through the console. I think you mentioned that at one point. So guys, thanks for that. So let's move into another use case. And so in this case, I think you might know where the punchline is going. We've talked about Snowball, we talked about DataSync. Guess what I get to talk about would be CloudEndure. And so we have this example of a VMware farm. Maybe you have, in this case, let's use 700 VMs, about 250 terabytes of data or so. And the customer is looking to shut down their data center. But one of the things to say about CloudEndure is that it doesn't need to be used just for migration. It can be a disaster recovery type of platform. So you can fire up CloudEndure to back up, give you a disaster recovery mechanism, in which case CloudEndure goes out and it basically creates an area where your VMs are all backed up. And then in the time when you need it, when you need to either shut down your data center or if you have an emergency or a disaster, then CloudEndure allows you a very quick way to recover. A couple of things about CloudEndure over doing this VM migration. The VMs actually get moved to EC2, Amazon EC2, and you can do it over kind of the same question: how much network capacity do you have? You have a 10 gig link, certainly that's ample, but it can work over very, very efficiently over lesser bandwidths as needed. And so the way that CloudEndure works is that it's very flexible. It tries to automate the process of doing these VM migrations. It's very reliable. It sets up essentially a staging area where you have the VMs staged, and so when you need to move it to production, if you needed to recover from a disaster, you have a very quick way to do that. The other thing is that it's very non-disruptive to production workloads, and so it kind of happens in the background. It installs on existing agents, existing VMs, and OS support is throughout the service. And probably one of the best things about the service is that now that AWS has bought CloudEndure, we've actually been able to make it available at no cost to our customers and partners. So there's no reason not to take a look at CloudEndure if you have virtual environments where you want to do mass migrations of live migrations. So let's talk about an additional use case here. And this is for both of you. So we went to Snowball, we went to DataSync and CloudEndure, and now we're going to kind of all collectively talk. So you can kind of see the flow of this webinar here. But let's talk about hybrid data processing flows. And what does that mean? That's really something that's very common. I think we see it a lot in life sciences. I think you can see this in other industries. Like life sciences is the one that occurs to me. But the idea is that you have data that you want to process in AWS. Maybe it's a genomics company that needs to go and take a lot of data and fire up instances, fire up compute in the cloud, and take advantage of that processing power and be able to run analytics on that data. Maybe they need to import it into a database, whatever they might need to do. Maybe, Brian, I'll go back to you quickly here and talk about how you would look at a situation like this, life sciences customer. How would Snowball play into that? How would you talk to this customer about moving this data, this research data into the cloud?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly talked to quite a few life sciences customers, and where Snowball tends to fit there, at least from the experiences I've had, is the first use case is we have archived data that is not necessarily being used as often, right? And it's quite large, right? And I want to use my active network links for active processing, active data, and so that's a very kind of common theme where there is, in the genomics world, let's just say, data that was collected many, many years ago, lower resolution, lower fidelity. And so in that use case, we see a scenario where they want to use Snowball to offline data, transfer it into the cloud, put it into a lower cost tier of S3, such as Glacier, right? Such as Glacier, even Deep Archive for certain use cases, depending on how old that data is, right? Because this science has been being done for a number of decades now. So that's kind of a common theme.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, right? And in life sciences is kind of what we talked about. It's not the only vertical where you might have data processing needs, certainly. But Paul, maybe you can talk to a life sciences customer, let's kind of stay with that maybe they have ample bandwidth, right? And maybe they have, instead of having archived data, maybe they're archiving that for compliance reasons and using Snowball, as Brian said. Maybe they need to get it up there much more real time, maybe, or much more quickly for processing.
Yeah, and life sciences is a good example where they're generating data maybe on lab equipment.
Yep.
But they really want to process it in the cloud. They have data pipelines that run in the cloud that do analysis of this data. And it's sort of a dual play, because sometimes that data is coming off equipment in the lab and they want to do some pre-processing on it, which maybe is sort of in the purview of Snowball Edge. Maybe they want to do some aggregation, some quality control checks. And then they want to move that data to the cloud. And Brian mentioned earlier time to value. Really, that data is valueless after it comes off the sequencer until they can analyze it through that data pipeline. And that's sort of where DataSync comes in, helping them move that data efficiently and in an automated way from on-premises into the cloud. DataSync will move that data. Again, I mentioned that we're sort of cloud first with our view of the world, so we're going to store it in whichever storage service that you want. And for many customers that are running big data workloads, this is in S3. We're integrated with things like CloudWatch events. So once that data lands in S3, we're going to fire off a CloudWatch event, which you could then use to trigger your downstream data pipeline. Again, we see the same pattern of data being generated in one place, typically on-premises, processed in cloud. I mentioned manufacturing facilities. We see it in, say, chip fabrication, where you're taking high-resolution data off the chip fab. You want to process it in cloud and bring some tuning parameters back to your fabrication facility to increase the yield. Time the speed with which you can do that and get that result back, faster you can get higher yield, the more money you save, the less bad product you basically build.
Yes.
So this idea of sort of these round tripping on the active data is sort of where DataSync might fit in this particular model. And at that point, you want, it's the need for speed. It's how quickly can we move this to get time to value.
Yeah, so DataSync is very, very good for active workloads, right? There's another component, you kind of alluded to it, Paul, where you move the data into the cloud and you get it into, say, an S3 bucket, and now you may want to bring it back down to the maybe there's an application or maybe there's a user or service that needs to get access to it from on-premises. I mean, you talk about that and specifically talking about storage gateway and how you would go and access that data.
Yeah. So while DataSync allows you to move data around, storage gateway allows you to access data in the cloud. And so particular file gateway is one of the modes of storage gateway that we provide today, which allows you to view an S3 bucket as a set of files, so from a file-based application. And so in that mode, you can use something like DataSync or Snowball to get that data into the cloud. And then you can use something like file gateway to then access that data that's stored in S3 back on premises. And we see a lot of customers doing this both with active and archival data. So you can think of File Gateway as an access or to an active archive, a huge archive of data that's sat in S3. Through a small VM that you deploy on premises, you have access to all of that data as if it was a file, as if it was a set of files locally to you. So for active archive and active sort of workloads that want to be able to view that archive, you don't have to have it locked away on tapes. They have to go have pulled and put into the tape library and download. It can take days or weeks to get data in that mode. If everything's in S3, it's immediately accessible through something like Storage Gateway running in as a file gateway.
Right, and so the corollary to that is that if you move the data into an S3 bucket with Snowball, right, it's also available there for File Gateway to be able to pull that down.
The three services sort of sit together and allow you to both transfer and access.
It becomes a very complementary way to utilize the services, right? Certainly, Brian talked about some use cases for Snowball, use cases for DataSync, and then File Gateway gives you that ability to access cloud resident data from on-premises. So I want to talk about one more use case. And in this case, and I don't know if there's a debate, but I'll let you guys kind of share your opinions here. The idea here is that you have a customer who is looking to scale and decommission a NAS. They have 200 terabytes of files. They want to be able to place that data up in EFS, so it's going to be a file system. It's going to be they're decommissioning their NAS in their application, so they're going to host that data in EFS. And they have about 5 gigs of bandwidth available, and they want to be able to move that data, have that be available up in the cloud. So with that, I'm going to go to Paul first. I'm going to change my thing here. So Paul, what do you talk about that use case and what you think about?
To me, that one, again, it's a customer that has bandwidth to spare. They're connected. It's data center. It's coming from a data center environment. Their target is EFS. We're integrated with EFS. In VPC access to EFS file systems. So for DataSync, it's a point and click in the console. Select your EFS file system. Select your NFS file or on-prem. Click go, and we'll copy that data over. Again, our incremental forever model. So if they have an active workload, in this case, you're talking about an archive, so it's likely inactive. So it would be a one-shot copy of that data over. Customer can basically hit go and watch their CloudWatch metrics and watch that data fly over that 5 gigabit network.
Yep. And I think 5 gigs in this case for 200 terabytes is a relatively ample amount of bandwidth. So it would, like to say,
it's within a work week, right? It's 4 or 5 days.
Right. So Brian, let's change it up a little bit, right? I don't have 5 gigabits of bandwidth. I have maybe I have a gig or a few hundred megs. Does that change how you think about it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it really comes down to you still have a month, right? If we really look at the time for this use case, they're targeting, let's just say 30 days, right? Even if we go down to 1 gig, we'll still be able to hit that with the DataSync option. The question then becomes, how steady is that bandwidth availability, right? Is it real bursty? Is that really available? The other question is, does the customer want to use that network bandwidth for it? There's a lot of times, and those of you sitting, looking at this tech talk, you understand that there's sometimes bureaucracy to overcome to get access to that network bandwidth. Sometimes it's readily accessible, right at your fingertips. Sometimes it takes a little bit of work, and so I've certainly run into situations very similar to this where our online data transfer functions with DataSync and even the hybrid use cases with storage are by far the easiest easiest fit for the customer. But other limitations come up, and whether it's accessibility or even just perceived cost, right? Because they're sharing costs associated with that link and so forth. And I think it's always something that needs to be untangled. But the other aspect I should bring up here is that Snowball Edge, well suited to handle this, would be effectively 3 of our Snowball Edge storage optimized devices. Would be fairly low level of effort on premise to make this happen. But the data for this service really ends up on S3. So then it'd have to be then transferred from S3 to EFS, which is, again, not overly complicated, but it takes time. And so I would lay that out, for the customer and say, if that makes sense to you, then you have these options. And I think that's the best part about, all of us, sitting here talking about this. We do have a lot of tools. Sometimes those tools overlap in use cases, but the key is we want to provide, our customers and all the options that they can use to solve these problem sets. So
I think while there's overlap in the use case, once you get down to the individual customer and the nuances of their environment or the business environment or technical environment they're working in, the correct service falls out that fits their use case,
right, and
their specific use case,
right, and those variables change, like you're hinting at, right? Like they may say they want to move this data in a month, but then they realize what's entailed, all the whether it's bureaucracy or cost or just maybe there's some operational things on their own side. Maybe there's some other issues, environmental things involved. So consequently, you go faster or slower depending on what we find. And I think that, that's one of the points of this is that there's no right or wrong answer to any of these use cases. We can go through 50 use cases. We can go through 500 use cases.
That's our next stop, right?
Yeah, that's our next stop. 500 use cases in an hour. We'll do a speed run. But, I think the idea is that we just wanted to get people thinking, people that were listening in for the webinar. We are just about to wrap up. But before we do, I just wanted to say you can go out to aws.amazon.com. You can check out DataSync. You can check out Snowball, CloudEndure, Storage Gateway, all these services that we've talked about today. Another great opportunity that some of you may be aware of is we do our AWS reInvent show, which is going to be held this year. I think it's December 2nd, which seems far away. But it's right around the corner. Trust us, we've already started planning for it, and that's in Las Vegas, Nevada. And so thank you very much for your time. Brian, Paul, thank you very much. I'm Chris Rodgers. Thanks for joining. Appreciate your time.